In this episode of Inside Corporate Finance, we break down the latest trade tensions ignited by former U.S. President Donald Trump, his recent threats to impose a 200% tariff on European wines and other alcoholic beverages, as well as increased duties on steel and aluminum, are escalating the transatlantic trade war to new levels. We discuss what's behind Trump's renewed tariff threats, the European Union's response and planned countermeasures, how Canada, Mexico, and China are reacting, the direct impact on financial markets, with major U.S. indices like the S&P 500 and Nasdaq falling, why investor sentiment is shifting, and how companies are bracing for supply chain disruptions and higher input costs. If you're in finance, trade policy, or corporate strategy, this is essential insight. Like, subscribe, and share this episode with your network. Contact us for feedback, comments, or partnerships. insidecorporatefinance@gmail.com.
All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle this whole thing with President Trump and all the tariffs he's been throwing around. We got some really interesting articles here from Bloomberg, Yahoo Finance, and Investing.com, all published, I think, just yesterday and today, March 12-13, 2025. And we're going to take a look at how all of this is affecting, well, you guessed it, your investment portfolio, maybe in some ways that you haven't even thought about.
It's pretty fascinating how these tariffs are impacting everything. We're talking the global economy, everything from, how much you're going to pay for that bottle of wine you like to the stock market as a whole. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. So let's start with a quick recap of what's been going on just to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so Trump, he recently put a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum coming in from Canada and Mexico. And then, get this, he threatened to double those tariffs to 50%. Can you believe that?
Yeah, it was a pretty bold move for sure. But, after he talked with some officials like the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, he actually backed down from that threat. So it seems like maybe they're trying to de-escalate things a bit on that front. Who knows? Maybe cooler heads will prevail.
Well, we'll see about that. Canada's not just taking this lying down, though.
Yeah.
They've already announced retaliatory tariffs. And we're not talking small potatoes here. We're talking 20 billion Canadian dollars worth of tariffs on all sorts of U.S. products, computers, sports equipment, even cast iron.
Yeah, they're not messing around. And, it's not just North America that's caught up in all this. The EU is getting involved, too. They're planning to slap counter tariffs on 26 billion euros worth of stuff from the U.S. That's about $28 billion. Things like bourbon, whiskey, and boats are going to get hit.
It's a full-blown trade war, that's for sure. And then there's this whole thing that really caught my eye. Trump threatened to put a 200% tariff on European wines, champagne included.
Yeah, the wine thing is pretty interesting. Part of it is because of these EU tariffs that have been on American whiskey for a while now. So it's kind of like, well, you hit our whiskey, we'll hit your wine. Tit for tat, right?
So if you like your French wine, better stock up now, I guess. But these tariffs aren't just affecting what we buy, Businesses are having to make some pretty big changes to deal with all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Bloomberg had a really interesting article about this pharmaceutical company, Novo Nordisk. To avoid all these tariff costs, they're actually moving some of their medicine production from the U.S. over to Vietnam. Think about the logistics of that, moving a whole manufacturing process overseas. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, that's a huge undertaking for sure. It really shows you how seriously companies are taking these tariffs. And then there's Boeing, the big airplane company. They're also feeling the heat, facing supply chain disruptions and higher costs. That could end up affecting how many planes they can make and, ultimately their profits.
Yeah, and then there's this Chinese online retailer, Shein, you might have heard of them. They're offering incentives to their apparel suppliers to move production to Vietnam too, all to try to dodge the tariffs. It's crazy how much these tariffs are reshaping global supply chains.
It seems like every industry is getting hit in some way. But let's talk about the stock market for a minute. The S&P 500, it's been on this amazing run, the longest winning streak since the 2008 financial crisis. But now it seems like it's finally hit a wall. And a lot of people are pointing to all this trade war uncertainty as the reason why.
Yeah, that's definitely a factor. And, this is happening at a time when a lot of people were already saying the market was, getting a little too expensive. Some experts are even saying this could be the start of a market correction. And just, for anyone who isn't familiar with that term, a correction basically means the market drops by 10% or more pretty quickly. So it can be a little scary for investors.
Okay, so that's one perspective. But There are always two sides to every coin. Some people see this as like a buying opportunity, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. You've got Wall Street analysts all over the place with different opinions. Some are saying, be careful, wait and see how this all plays out. But then you've got others who are like, hey, this is a chance to get some stocks at a bargain price. So it's a real gamble either way, that's for sure. A lot of uncertainty out there.
Yeah, it makes you wonder who to believe. All this uncertainty is definitely making investors nervous. But let's look at one industry that's really feeling the pressure, the U.S. auto industry. Take Stellantis, for example, the company that owns Jeep. Their share price has dropped like more than 2% recently.
And there's a pretty clear reason for that. You see, Stellantis, they import a ton of steel and aluminum, which means they're really sensitive to any price increases caused by these tariffs. And I think this drop in their share price could be a sign of things to come for other automakers who are in the same boat, relying on all those imported materials.
It's kind of ironic, right? Because the former CEO of Stellantis, Carlos Tavares, he actually raised prices before to try and offset tariff costs under, the Trump administration. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place now.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. I mean, what are they going to do? Can Stellantis and these other car companies just absorb these extra costs? Or are they going to have to raise prices again? And if they do that, well, who knows what will happen to their sales? It's a tough call.
Yeah, no easy answers there. So I guess what we're seeing here is that these tariffs, they're not just some abstract economic policy. They're having a very real impact, on businesses, consumers, the stock market, and it's all happening in ways that are pretty surprising.
Absolutely. And there's another big piece of this puzzle that we haven't even talked about yet, and that's the potential long-term impact on the global economy as a whole. Could this trade war actually lead to a wider economic slowdown? I think that's something we all need to keep in mind as this whole situation continues to develop.
It's crazy to think about how these companies are like scrambling to deal with these tariffs. But I think it's important to step back for a minute and, look at the bigger picture here.
Yeah, zooming out like this is really important because, the global economy is so interconnected. It's like if one part of the world starts to struggle, the whole thing can feel it. And these tariffs, they're like throwing a wrench into the whole system, disrupting how goods move around, creating all this uncertainty. It could lead to less investment, less economic activity overall.
So are you saying that this trade war could, make the whole global economy slow down?
That's definitely a real concern, yeah. And what's kind of scary is that we're already seeing signs that the global economy is, losing steam. Growth has been slowing down in a lot of major economies lately, and this trade war can make things a lot worse.
But I've heard some economists say that the global economy is, pretty resilient, that it can handle these kinds of disruptions.
Yeah, that's true. There are always different opinions on these things, and some people are more optimistic than others. But I think it's pretty clear that all this uncertainty caused by the trade war, it's not helping anyone. Businesses are having a hard time planning for the future, and consumers are getting nervous. It's just not a good environment for growth.
And that uncertainty is definitely reflected in the stock market, right? Like we were talking about before, it's been pretty volatile lately.
Exactly. The stock market is basically reacting to all these developments in real time. But this is about more than just short-term ups and downs in the market. This trade war has the potential to, reshape the entire global economy for years to come. We could end up in a world that's more divided, more protectionist, with less free trade and more barriers to doing business internationally.
So basically like a big step backwards for globalization.
It's a real possibility, yeah. For decades we've been moving towards a more globalized world, but this trade war could really reverse that trend.
Okay, but let's bring this down to earth for a second. How is all of this going to affect the average person? What does it mean for their everyday lives?
Well, we've already talked about how prices could go up for imported goods like wine and cars, right? So consumers might end up having to pay more for the things they enjoy. And if businesses have to raise prices or, even worse, start laying people off because of the tariffs, well, that could have a domino effect throughout the whole economy. It could even lead to a recession.
So the potential consequences for everyday people are pretty serious.
Absolutely. And we have to remember this trade war is still unfolding. We don't know how it's all going to end.
So basically, we're all just kind of stuck waiting to see what happens.
Yeah, in a way, I guess so. But in the meantime, I think it's really important to stay informed, Understand how all of this is affecting your own personal finances and investments.
Good advice. Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier about how some analysts are seeing this as a buying opportunity in the stock market. Do you think that's actually a good idea?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. Like with any investment, it depends on your own individual situation, how much risk you're comfortable with, what your goals are, how long you plan to invest. If you're in it for the long haul, you might be able to ride out this volatility and end up doing okay. But if you're more risk-averse, it might be better to wait until things settle down a bit.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's always a good idea to talk to a financial advisor before making any big investment decisions, especially when things are this uncertain. They can help you figure out what makes sense for you.
That's a good point. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. We've talked about a few specific companies, but is there any way to figure out, which companies are the most vulnerable to these tariffs?
Yeah, definitely. One way is to look at a company's supply chain, see how much they rely on imported goods. If a company imports a lot of its raw materials or components, they're going to be more affected by tariffs.
Makes sense.
And another thing to consider is how much a company does business overseas. If they're selling a lot of products in other countries, they could get hit by retaliatory tariffs.
So companies that are really involved in global trade are at higher risk.
Exactly. And it's not just about the direct effects of tariffs either. You have to think about the indirect effects too. For example, if a company's suppliers get hit by tariffs, that could drive up costs for the company, even if they don't import stuff directly.
It's like this whole complicated web of interconnections.
Yeah, it really is. And that's why it's so important for investors to do their research, really understand the potential risks before putting money into any company.
It seems like we've mostly been talking about the negative side of these tariffs. Is there any chance they could have some positive effects?
That's a really interesting question. Some people argue that tariffs could actually lead to more manufacturing happening in the U.S., bringing jobs back home. If companies have to start sourcing their goods domestically, that could be a boost for the economy.
So maybe there's a silver lining to all of this.
Maybe. But it's important to remember that this is a really complicated issue. There are so many factors at play. We just don't know yet what the long-term consequences will be, both good and bad.
So basically, there's still a lot we don't know about how this trade war is going to play out.
Yeah, that's the truth. And it's definitely something we're going to keep a close eye on in the coming months and years.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the final leg of our deep dive into this whole trade war situation and what it means for the markets. What are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is that these tariffs are about more than just economics. They're about power, global power dynamics, countries trying to gain leverage over each other. It's about the future of the world order, really.
Okay, I think we need to break that down a little bit. What does that actually mean for the average person? Why should they care about these global power struggles?
Well, for one thing, it means that we're living in a time of massive uncertainty. The rules are changing and nobody really knows what the new rules are going to be. And that uncertainty can have a huge impact on the economy, on businesses, investors, consumers, everyone.
So are you saying we should all be bracing ourselves for a bumpy ride?
It's definitely a possibility. But at the same time, uncertainty can also create opportunities, like we talked about. Some investors see this as a chance to buy stocks at a discount, and some companies might actually benefit from the way global trade is shifting.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not necessarily, but it's definitely important to be aware of the risks and to make smart decisions.
And that's where we come in, right? Helping our listeners make sense of all of this and figure out what it means for them.
Exactly. And one of the best things people can do is focus on the fundamentals. Whether you're an investor or a business owner or just someone trying to manage your money, it's so important to have a solid financial foundation.
So things like budgeting, saving, diversifying your investments, that kind of stuff.
All of that, yeah. And it's also crucial to stay informed, Keep up with what's happening in the world and be ready to adapt as things change.
One thing that really struck me as we were doing this deep dive is how companies are having to get creative to deal with these tariffs, like moving their entire production to different countries. That's a pretty big deal.
It really is. It just shows you that companies are taking this seriously and are willing to make big changes to adapt to this new global environment.
So it's a time for innovation and resilience.
Absolutely. For those who can adapt and evolve, there might actually be some really great opportunities that come out of this.
Well, that's a hopeful thought.
It is. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. We're living through a time of huge change, But change can also bring new possibilities.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So, to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and, maybe even a little bit inspiring.
And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. The world is changing fast, but we can get through this together and hopefully build a better future.
Until next time. So we've really been digging into this whole global trade war thing and how it's affecting the markets. And honestly, it feels like there are way more questions than answers right now.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. There's so much going on, it's really hard to know for sure what's going to happen in the long run. But I think the best thing we can do is, try to understand the different possibilities and arm ourselves with as much knowledge as possible. That way, we can at least make informed decisions.
So instead of trying to predict the future, maybe we should focus on, the bigger forces that are at work here. We've talked about how companies are adapting and how investors are reacting. But what about, unintended consequences? Are there things that could happen that nobody's really expecting?
That's a really important point. For example, some people say that these tariffs are going to boost American manufacturing, bring jobs back to the U.S. Which sounds good, right? But what if that means that prices go up for consumers because companies are forced to use more expensive domestic suppliers? And what if it stifles competition?
So it's like you're trying to protect American industries, but you could end up hurting consumers and the market overall. It's a tough balance.
Exactly. And it's not just about economics either. These tariffs are a big part of global politics, too. They can be used as leverage in international negotiations, and they can have a huge impact on alliances and partnerships between countries.
So it's like a giant game of chess with all these different players and strategies.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the outcome of this game is going to shape the world for a long time to come.
It's kind of a scary thought, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess for now, the best thing to do is just stay informed, be flexible, and be ready to adapt to whatever happens.
I totally agree. We all need to pay attention to what's happening and be prepared to adjust our plans, whether we're investors, business owners, or just everyday people trying to make ends meet.
Well said. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up our deep dive into this whole trade war mess and what it means for all of us. To our listeners, thanks for sticking with us on this journey. It's been a wild ride.
I think the biggest takeaway here is that knowledge is power. The more we understand what's happening in the world, the better equipped we'll be to make good decisions, especially during these uncertain times.
Absolutely. So until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and we'll see you back here soon for another deep dive.